Is inflation the biggest risk to economic stability in 2023? Let's find out. Inflation, the blast from the past that's here to haunt the 20s. After decades of having inflation under control, the last year has seen inflation well and truly become a pressing issue for governments, central banks, and households. It doesn't take some world-class economist to figure out everything today is costing significantly more than it did a year ago. But what is more complex to understand is how rising interest rates are the solution to this problem. There are two key arms of economics, fiscal and monetary policy. In most advanced economies, the fiscal policy is set by the parliament each year in what is known as the government budget. This budget contains all the planned spending that the government is going to undertake during that year and all the proposed revenues the government will receive. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is often set by an independent board that focuses on dealing with inflation through the setting of interest rates. Both economic policies can have either two stances, contractionary or expansionary. Contractionary policies are aimed to reduce the overall economic activity and occur through either less government spending, increased taxes, or with the central bank increasing the interest rates. Expansionary policy is the reverse, more government spending, less taxes and lower interest rates. In Australia, the central bank that is tasked with this is the Reserve Bank of Australia, or commonly referred to as the RBA. Its goal is to keep inflation between 2 to 3% over the course of the economic cycle. Now that doesn't mean that inflation is going to be between that target every single time. Since the target was introduced in 1993, inflation has been outside that range during any given quarter of the year 25 out of the last 29 years. This demonstrates how difficult it is to get the perfect monetary policy setting and why the aim has always been to take a long-term view on inflation versus overreacting to one inflation number that's outside the target. Overall, this strategy had worked well up to the shocks of COVID-19, which made the role of the RBA more complex. How does increasing interest rates control inflation? Doesn't it just make my mortgage or rent more expensive? Whilst you're correct to think that rising rates just makes everything more expensive, what the central bank is trying to do is reduce inflation by taking a contractionary monetary policy stance. The theory is that as interest rates rise, individuals, businesses and governments, who are the three biggest spenders in the economy, have less money to spend because more capital is required to service the debt. This in turn means that individuals spend less of their income on discretionary items such as eating out, that's subscription-based services, businesses don't undertake that project, and governments delay plans. As a result, this leads to less demand in the economy. With less demand, it's hoped that prices become lower, thus leading to less inflation. Let's work on an example. Say you're a subcontractor that only wants to work 40 hours a week, but because of the expansionary monetary policy, you find yourself with 60 hours of work a week in demand. To offset this, you increase your prices from $75 to $100 an hour, the point at which you have exactly 40 hours of work. As monetary policy becomes contractionary, you notice that your work drops off and you now only have 20 hours of work a week at $100. And as a result, you lower your prices to $85 to make sure you have exactly 40 hours of work. This price change is the aim of a contractionary monetary policy, reduce prices by raising rates. That's how the government plans to control inflation. The Reserve Bank is hoping that their consecutive interest rate rises lead to lower prices for all goods and services in the economy, as explained previously. But this may have you thinking, what are the other negative consequences of lower prices? Well, like I said earlier, there are two stances of economic policy, either expansionary or contractionary. Contractionary is exactly what it means, getting smaller. And what's another common economic term that goes hand in hand with a contraction? A recession. Now that does not mean that there's going to be a recession. It's not a certainty that every time monetary policy shifts from being expansionary to contractionary that there is a recession. However, it's more difficult for the Reserve Bank to both fight inflation whilst not driving the economy off a cliff. It takes a combination of skills and luck to avoid a recession, especially when the cash rate is rising rapidly. Let's explore the consequences of if the Reserve Bank of Australia did nothing. The latest CPI figure, which is a measure of inflation in Australia, for the October quarter measured over 12 months was 6.9%. Let's just assume that inflation does not accelerate if nothing is done about it. That means that every year prices are going to get almost 7% more expensive. Now, as I said before, the target of the Reserve Bank was to have inflation between 2 to 3% over the course of the economic cycle. Now, that led to almost 30 years of economic stability in the economy. Given that the monetary policy stance of keeping inflation between this target led to a period of sustained stability, it's easy to assume that with inflation outside this target, there would be a lot of economic instability in Australia. One of the biggest issues with letting inflation get out of control or stay at elevated levels is the fact that wages are not keeping up with inflation by a significant amount. For the year ending September, wage growth was only 3.1%. That means that real wages are actually going backwards, leading to a cost of living crisis. Realistically, the Reserve Bank is stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's no good solution to the problems the economy currently faces with inflation. They either let inflation continue and hope that it subsides on its own, or raise interest rates to help bring down inflation. Each have their own consequences. However, in history, many mistakes have been made by central banks, especially in the US from the years 1965 to 1982, whereby inflation was at elevated levels. During this time period, there were 4 recessions and 2 severe energy price shortages, and to resolve inflation, it led to the implementation of wage and price controls. All central banks are mindful of the experiences of the last time of high inflation and are trying to ensure the world does not have to endure the same consequences that it did during these years. The fight against inflation is one that has many costs. It's important that central banks across the globe work on ensuring inflation subsides while simultaneously ensuring that increases to the interest rate don't drive the economy into a recession. If they construct this perfect balance, it's more likely that long-term stability and prosperity will return compared to if they did nothing. All we know for certain is the next 12 months is going to be a rocky ride while inflation stays high.